I've actually been quite scared to make this video, and not just because Silent Hill 2 is a scary game, but because Silent Hill 2 is a masterpiece. Everyone who plays it seems to form this intensely personal connection to it, and it has produced a lot of really wonderful commentary as a result, which makes the task of saying something new quite daunting. I think part of Silent Hill 2's appeal is its ambiguity. It does not give easily to a logical reading of its narrative that can explain away the game's reality. Consequently, it becomes open to a number of interpretations, but what has always struck me about Silent Hill 2 is how it seems to linger in the minds of its player almost like some sort of traumatic mark on their psyche, something that so deeply moved them it can be difficult to untangle how it does so. What is it about Silent Hill 2 that marks its player in this way? What does it do to its player that moves them so profoundly? And how has it managed to get into the head of so many players since its release? I think a good way to explore these questions is to consider the relationship between the player and James Sunderland, the protagonist in Silent Hill 2. We'll be focusing on how narrative and gameplay interact to form a deep connection between the player and James, and that means I'm going to spoil the entire game. So if you haven't played Silent Hill 2 yet, where have you been? Go play Silent Hill 2, it's really good. This is a spoiler warning. Furthermore, Silent Hill 2 does go to some nasty places and there is some disturbing content ahead, so I'm going to put a content warning in the description for those who need it. Be sure to check it out if that's the kind of thing you do need.
In my restless dreams, I see that town. Silent Hill.
Silent Hill 2 follows the story of James Sunderland, an everyman who gets a letter from his wife Mary asking him to come pick her up from the town of Silent Hill. This is a bit strange as Mary has been dead for 3 years. As the plot unfolds, James meets 4 other individuals. The first is Angela, a teenage girl looking for
my mother.
Angela is clearly suicidal after the abuse the game heavily implies she suffered at the hands of her father. Next there's Eddie, a man who seems oblivious to the events going on around him.
This town is full of monsters. How can you sit there and eat pizza?
And suffering from an inferiority complex that turns murderous towards the climax of the game. There's also a kid, Laura, who doesn't seem to like James much.
Ha ha, I tricked you.
Open the door, Laura.
And finally, there's Maria, who seems to look exactly like Mary but behaves nothing like her and expects James to, well...
You're supposed to take care of me.
And also seems to be very interested in sex, particularly sex with James. We learn about these characters through James's interactions with them. Indeed, it is James's perspective that frames much of the player's perspective in Silent Hill 2. It is James's perspective that the game uses to try and get in your head right from his opening monologue.
I got a letter.
This is not the first line of Silent Hill 2, but it is the beginning of the monologue that sets out James's history and desires. James received a letter from his wife, who died 3 years ago of an unnamed disease, telling him she is now waiting for him in the town of Silent Hill, where they once visited together as a couple. James uses the first person pronoun I here, and his narration informs the audience of the history that informs his character. James is a widower. James had a wife named Mary who apparently died, and James wants to find his wife if she is alive. What he is doing here is narrating to the player what we might call his sense of self or subjectivity, meaning everything from the past that came together to inform the actions James now takes in the present. This notion of subjectivity, or the subject, is going to be important going forward in this essay. Ultimately, I argue that Silent Hill 2's use of subjectivity is at the root of the game's lingering horror. Let's start with this rather complicated quote from Judith Butler's book, Giving an Account of the Self, and go through it sentence by sentence and see how it applies to Silent Hill 2 and James Sunderland. Butler begins, "The I is narrated, but also posited and articulated within the context of a scene of address. This means that when a subject speaks in the first person, they are not only conveying their sense of self in the form of a narrative, but doing so in relation to the context that surrounds that moment of narration. This is what Butler is referring to with the phrase scene of address, the conditions under which this narration occurs. This scene could take many forms. For example, a person meeting an old friend and catching them up on their life since they last spoke would constitute a scene, but so would a witness being asked to speak on a crime or a YouTuber telling their audience an amusing anecdote. Each of these scenes of address mark different relationships between the narrator and listener, and furthermore affect how the story about themselves is told. In the context of James narrating to the player, the developer's choice to present this scene in the form of a cutscene, which is a name for a non-interactive cinematic sequence in a game, introduces a certain power imbalance. In audiovisual mediums, such as the cutscene's closest parallel, the film, voiceovers are often used to give authority to the speaking voice. Rather than situating James's voice in his body, the voiceover signifies a kind of objectivity on the part of the narrator. This puts James in a position of power over the player, as James, free of their control, is able to communicate his narrative without intervention from the player, while downplaying the possibility the player might suspect that his narrative is inaccurate. This structure of address is imperative for creating a relationship between James and you, the player. Butler continues, "The you to whom I speak constitutes an object in relation to which an aim of desire becomes articulable." Here, Butler describes a relationship where the narrator or I speaks to an object constituted as you, positioning the narrator as active in the scene. Transferring this to Silent Hill 2, where James is the narrator. James, as the narrator, gets to narrate the scene while the player can only passively listen and observe. The relationship thus described implies an agency on the part of James that is lacking in the player. What's more, this agency is used not only to articulate a desire to the player, that desire being the desire to save Mary, but furthermore, the social, cultural, and historical structures that frame that desire. This is what Butler means by articulable. Not just the scene of address that structures the relationship between the narrator and audience that we have just discussed, but also the entire history that precedes the encounter and enables the desire to exist in the first place, be communicated by James and rendered in terms that are understandable to the player. James's desire to find his wife is predicated upon the cultural idea of what the relationship between a man and a wife is, and would not be possible if the cultural institution of marriage did not exist. Because this institution does exist, and the relationship between a husband and wife is something the player already understands, we already begin to form ideas about James that aren't stated directly in the monologue. Each element of James's history here, his status as a widower, the tragedy of Mary's death, rushes forward into James's narration of his sense of self, helping the player to understand James by calling upon cultural institutions the player already knows about and understands, and thus gives the player entry into James's subjectivity as he describes to us his desire to find Mary. Because James's story plays on societal roles and ideas the player instinctively understands, while also making us feel sympathetic to James due to the loss of his wife, we easily accept his goal to find Mary as our own when we take control of James. And this moment of lending us a desire is important when we consider the conclusion of Butler's quote. "So I tell a story to you," Butler writes, "and we might together consider the details of the story that I tell. But if I tell them to you in the context of a transference, and can there be telling without transference? I am doing something with this telling, acting on you in some way. And this telling is also doing something to me, acting on me, in ways that I may not understand as I go." For Butler, transference refers to the ways in which a subject narrating itself constructs a relationship with the listener, but I think this takes on a slightly different meaning in the context of Silent Hill 2 and video games more broadly. In Silent Hill 2, we're not just placed in relation to James, but through James. It is through James's perspective we explore Silent Hill, meet its inhabitants, and discover the secrets trapped in his mind. Our goals and desires map to his, and we seem to take on something of his subjectivity. We are enmeshed with his subjective experience of the world. However, this does not mean that James and the player are the same subject. For one thing, our desires are different, although aligned. While James's desire is to find his wife, the player's desire is to find stimulation in the game and reach the end. James's desire merely becomes a conduit through which the player's desire is channeled. In my search for finding James's wife, I hope to find stimulation and be led to a satisfying conclusion as a player. Yet, Butler positions desire as one of the most important aspects of subjectivity. Even at this early stage, Silent Hill 2 seems to be working on the player, shifting their subjectivity by giving form to a desire. Indeed, this suggests that part of the purpose of the narration is to get into the player's head by working on their subjective relation to James and Silent Hill 2 more generally. But this is only at the level of narrative. If we extend this concept into gameplay, we see even further crossover between James's subjectivity and that of the player. Indeed, we do not grasp James as an entity distinct from us, but rather an extension of our own movements. When philosophers talk about subjectivity, they often do so in the same breath with which they talk about movement and agency, suggesting an intimate link between movement and subjectivity. In Silent Hill 2, the player is learning how they might move through James. The player's ability to act in the world of Silent Hill 2 is contingent upon James's ability to react to it. On one level, this means through the player's manipulation of the controller in their hands, and on another level, this refers to actions James takes as a consequence of the player's manipulation of the controller. In both cases, subjectivity is linked to a certain way of physically navigating a world. As we will see, this suggests that getting into the player's head extends beyond some sort of psychological phenomenon and affects how we physically manipulate the controller and move James in the game world. We might call this our bodily attitude towards that game world. To take this idea back to Butler, we see that she takes great pains to emphasize that our subjectivity shapes and structures how we might act and move through a world. This is an important element of Butler's philosophy, as Butler does not subscribe to a crude definition of subjectivity that understands the subject as possessing some sort of pure agency independent of the world around them. Instead, the subject is always located in a historical moment. Consequently, our sense of self is dependent upon relations to others that influence us before we have a sense of ourselves in the first place. These can be personal relations, like our relationships with our mothers, fathers, caregivers. But they can also be institutional. For instance, if one is assigned a particular gender at birth, their sense of subjectivity and how they experience the world will be affected by how a particular society in a particular historical moment understands gender, and particularly the gender they are assigned. The movements that are available to that subject become shaped through this history, a core component of Butler's early work on gender. When a subject acts, Butler says the subject is acted upon as it acts. In Silent Hill 2, both James and the player as subjects are acting upon each other, but they also support and help form or reform each other's subjectivity. We have seen that James is acting upon the player from the moment the game begins, but equally, James's ability to act in the world is contingent upon the movements of the player as they manipulate the controller. The subjectivities of both James and the player seem to enter into a kind of networked connection and become increasingly difficult to separate. Although we've seen a number of similarities in the processes of subject formation in Silent Hill 2 and Judith Butler's work, I think this is where we have to start moving away from Butler to fully understand the power of Silent Hill 2 and how it gets in the head of its player. Butler often presents her ideas concerning subject formation in the form of an oppositional encounter between two individuals. While her theory is reasonably sound, I think the consequence of this approach is rendering the subject as an always innocent being who is denied agency in the encounter. Take, for instance, this quote from Precarious Life, The Powers of Mourning and Violence. The subject, Butler writes, is undone in the face of the other, by the touch, by the scent, by the feel, by the prospect of the touch, by the memory of the feel. Here, the other acts upon the subject, threatening their undoing through their touch or the loss of their touch, while the subject remains still, maintaining a purity through a lack of action, a lack of response to the face, touch, scent, or feel of the other that might threaten the other the way the other threatens them. Indeed, I think there is a certain romanticization of the pure, unmoving subject in Butler's post-9/11 work that creates a passive form of politics that is incapable of fighting against power. But the player as subject in Silent Hill 2 cannot be innocent in this way. The player is not passive, nor are their actions oppositional to James. In fact, the player and James are subjectively aligned, and the more the player learns about James, the less innocent this connection seems. I think the opening sections of Silent Hill 2 work to bring James and the player into closer and closer overlap as subjects, in order to belay any sense of innocence on the part of the player as the game unfolds and various revelations about James are revealed to the player.
No. I killed her.
We learn how to move James through our own movements, by pressing buttons on a controller that result in James taking certain actions. This puts us into direct contact with James's subjective agency in the game space. After all, outside of cutscenes, James's actions are dependent upon what each button on the controller can do, and it is the player that activates those actions by pressing the relevant button. What's more, the atmosphere is built up in the early sections through musical and visual design that promote a sense of unease and encroaching danger to make the player feel under threat alongside James. For instance, consider the musical stabs that occur as James walks down a footpath that audibly signify danger even though no actual danger is present in the game space. This puts the player in a defensive mindset that only intensifies when the player heads down towards the first real example of combat in the game, following a trail of blood and the intense radio static that we will soon learn signifies the presence of monsters. Thus, when the player enters the tunnel to fight the monster, the player is so on edge that when James reaches for a weapon, the player quickly follows his line of thought and starts to beat the shit out of the enemy. Complementing the cutscenes then, these gameplay sections serve to bring the player into alignment with the subjective agency of James. This extends past the linguistic formation of the subject through first-person narration into an imposition of subjective formations through a kind of bodily attitude towards the world of Silent Hill 2. The player moves and acts in the world of the game along the lines of how James can move and act. This implicates us in the subjective experience of James, mixing up James and the player as subjects. But then the game makes a narrative term that fractures the smoothness of the subjective overlaying. As the game unfolds, it becomes increasingly apparent that James's memories aren't entirely accurate, and the characters start to accuse him of hiding something.
You didn't love Mary anyway.
Wait!
You loved her, right? Or maybe you hated her.
I know about you. You didn't want her around anymore.
Eventually, it is revealed that James murdered Mary. He had repressed his memories of this and created a story to cover up the truth that even he believed. Everything James had told us about himself was a lie. This puts the relationship between James and the player under pressure, as the player may be getting more than they bargained for. However, if the player is to reach their desire, to find a satisfying conclusion to their play experience, then they are forced to remain within the confines of James's subjectivity. In my view, this is one of the most effective moves of Silent Hill 2, as it draws the player into James's crime. James can only act as a subject if there is a player there to play him. This means that, while the player is not responsible for Mary's death, they have supported both James as a subject and supported his lie. The player begins to feel implicated in James's crime. As James and the player are tied together so tightly, this creates an uneasy feeling that when the game is casting blame at James, they're also casting blame at the player. While James has done the crime, we have supported James. We have acted as his enabler. It is important at this point to consider the gender dynamics of James's crime and think about how Silent Hill 2 explores the notion of misogyny, which I think it does with mixed results. In Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny, analytical philosopher Kate Manne describes misogyny not as a belief in the inferiority of women held in the heart of something, but rather as a culturally transmitted sense of entitlement that women should be functional and relational. By the lights of patriarchal ideology, a woman is often expected to play the role of a man's attentive, loving subordinate, to maintain a loving gaze towards the dominant, metaphorically. Furthermore, she writes, misogyny's essence lies in its social function, not in its psychological nature. Misogyny manifests when women refuse or are unable to fulfill this functional or relational dynamic to men, often in the form of violence. Misogyny writes Manne, polices and enforces the governing norms of patriarchal societies and contributes to much of the violence women face today, with intimate partner violence being a common and alarming manifestation of misogyny today. The relationship between Mary and James falls into this dynamic. Mary, the ever-doting wife, falls ill and in her illness is understandably unable to look upon James lovingly or serve his needs.
What are you looking at? Get the hell out of here! Leave me alone already! I'm no use to anyone.
Silent Hill 2 makes clear that James is particularly sexually frustrated through its use of monster design. The enemy nurses recall the nurses that James must have seen on his trips to see Mary. The monstrous nurses are scantily dressed, even as they take on nightmarish forms, suggesting that with Mary unable to satisfy James sexually, he looked elsewhere. This becomes even more obvious when one looks at Maria, a creation of Silent Hill born from James's repressed sexual desires, who looks just like Mary but seems much more willing to have sex with James.
Don't you want to touch me?
I don't know.
Come and get me. I can't do anything through these bars.
Furthermore, after telling James she knows all about him, Angela accuses James of only being interested in sex.
I know what you're up to. It's always the same. You're only after one thing.
Indeed, James's motivation for murdering Mary seems to be rooted in a misogynistic expectation that a woman should fulfill a man's sexual desires, an expectation Mary cannot fulfill once she falls ill. Of course, I don't think Silent Hill 2 turns the player into a misogynist. That would be ridiculous. What I think Silent Hill does do is open up the subjective background that informs misogyny and implicates the player within its structure, allowing the player to study that structure from within. It forces the player to confront the subjective structures that inform James's misogynistic actions, both personal, such as his sexual frustration and feeling of helplessness, and social, such as the expectations placed on Mary as a woman and wife, and the sexual role of men and women in patriarchal societies like our own. This creates a sense of unease for many players, as if we accept that James in some ways is reliant on the presence of the player to prop up his subjectivity, we are implicated in a misogynistic subjective structure. To return to our earlier critique of Butler, Silent Hill 2 refuses to let the player off the hook, making it clear that one can't touch the darkness at work in Silent Hill 2 and remain clean or innocent. It is a social kind of horror, and it is placed directly in the player's head. In this way, Silent Hill 2 is successful in its exploration of these elements, but I think that's only half the story. This is what I was referring to when I said that Silent Hill 2 explores misogyny with mixed results. While the game goes to great lengths to give insight into the horrors of misogynistic violence and its effects on the psyche through Angela, it still ends with a disappointing finale in which a woman, Maria or Mary depending on the player's choices, is put down. Perhaps this is what makes the game so disturbing to me. It never seems like James learns his lesson, and the player, so caught up with James, is unable to break with that misogyny. It offers little chance of redemption, of breaking the misogynistic cycle. Perhaps this is appropriate. As Kate Manne writes, an individual agent's attitudes or behaviour counts as misogynistic within a social context, insofar as it reflects or perpetuates misogyny therein. This implies that even if an agent breaks with misogyny, the system that upholds that misogyny will remain in place. Silent Hill 2 seems to mark its player with that misogyny, invoking us in a subjectivity rife with misogynistic disposition, and scars us with the knowledge of them. This is achieved through the dynamics of subject formation and interaction that appear in Silent Hill 2 and we have explored in this video. The horror of the game stems not only from the brilliant atmosphere the game builds, but also from the interconnection of the subjective dispositions of James and the player as James makes his way into our head. The player comes out of Silent Hill 2 with an awareness of the structures of misogyny in the real world, even if they cannot or refuse to name them as misogyny. This knowledge is implanted into our heads and cannot be ignored even as we move away from the game and reflect on the real world around us. This knowledge finds resonance in the world around us, as Silent Hill 2 gently works on the player long after the game has ended.
You'd better do something about that